It is almost Halloween here, and for today's Critical Thought, we're going to be returning to the topic of whether or not combat belongs in horror. Should you be able to rip and tear the enemy as well as they can rip and tear into you? Every year, we're getting new and interesting takes on horror design. From the job scary simulators to games emulating Resident Evil, Silent Hill, to even new Resident Evils and Silent Hills. And one of the aspects that has really evolved with horror over the last 10ish or so years has been, of course, a debate over combat. Does combat serve a purpose? If you give the player the ability to fight back, is it considered a horror game? And of course, this goes with the famous talk, I think the creator or the CEO of the frictional games said that he felt horror didn't need combat that would get in the way or distract from it. And many indie developers took that and ran away with it. From the likes of just having you hide and seek or hide and get stabbed, to the many Slenderman ripoffs and so on. And what we saw in kind of the last 4 or 5 years, and maybe a little bit more than that, with the return of Resident Evil 7, and of course now with Silent Hill F, is that more games or more horror titles are embracing combat. But the challenge when it comes to horror design is that it's a very thin line you have to walk between the use and implementation of combat. And this is one area where I feel that Silent Hill F is failing on as we've been playing through it. And it goes with another interesting aspect. Part of the problem, I think this goes back to the Amnesia director's comments, is that combat and horror kind of create this contradiction when it comes to the storytelling. This could even go back to as far as the original Tomb Raider reboot, or even further than that with the Uncharted games. You can't tell me, on one hand, Lara Croft is a scared teenage girl fighting for her life and struggling to deal with the horrors of her situation. And then, Lara Croft jumps 20 feet in the air to grab or kill people with her climbing hook, sets arrows on fire to deal with an entire small squad of military soldiers, and then just goes ripping and tearing all across the island. The same with Nathan Drake having, I think, a very impressive body count at this point after all the Uncharted games. And with Silent Hill F, there's also that weird dichotomy. You play a scared teenage girl where the adults and people have disappeared and she has no idea why everyone's trying to murder her. And then we can kind of shadow step Neo style to dodge enemies with iframes, have punish counters, and we even get a devil trigger at some point. And as a pro tip, if your game introduces the act of a devil trigger, it's not a horror game anymore. And that, I think, is a really good point about where I think the line should fall when it comes to horror design and combat. Combat should be a tool that the player has. It shouldn't be the only tool. You should not feel like you're being overly rewarded or embellished for using combat in a horror game. Some good examples that I like would be something like Amnesia the Bunker, and even stuff like Nun Massacre or Stay of the House from Puppet Combo. In all three of those games, your ability to fight is very limited. Bullets are exceptionally rare, and you even have to find the gun in the first place. And when you get that gun, it's not a matter of, oh, I am now invulnerable and can kill anything that gets in my way. The gun is considered a poop hits the fan moment in those games. You're not meant to be running around your gun out, getting ready to shoot anything that moves. It is there as a last resort or as a means of buying you some time to complete your objective. We could even do something as far back as Alien Isolation, that most of the weapons didn't work on the Xenomorph. You could use them against the minor enemies. But again, that also strays into that territory that if combat is too frequent and it's too much of an option, you lose that sense of horror. Fighting that enemy with a 2x4 for the first time is scary. Fighting the 50th, 80th version of them is not. And especially To go back to the point about incentivizing or embellishing horror, if your game has forced arena fights, that also tends to downplay the nature of horror. So with that said, by the power invested in me, I hereby coin the Mick Gordon Test, where if I can overlay any one of Mick Gordon's songs from either Doom game onto your gameplay, it cannot be considered a horror game anymore. So let's try that with Silent Hill F right now. Maybe that part didn't quite work. What about this? And how about this part right here? What is often lost by developers when it comes to that balance between action and horror is that the more you do it, or the more that it becomes a focal point, the less scary a game should be or will be. And there's nothing wrong with that. If we're talking about action horror design, that is kind of the whole MO. In the Dead Space games, it is cool to run around blasting limbs off the necromorphs and then telekinetically pick it up and fling it at another enemy, knocking them off or impaling them against the wall. But again, those games were not meant, or they were not advertised as being survival horror. And when we look at, again, the other end of the spectrum, with games that have no combat, in this respect, then it becomes very black and white. So what you're supposed to do. We just hide and wait, and the tension kind of has that one breakout moment the first time you're going to get caught by whatever it is, and then after that it just kind of fades away, because the only outcome that's going to happen if the serial killer finds you, or that guy opens up that one locker that you decide to hide in. And that's when fear turns into frustration. And it's why part of what we talk about with horror is that the player should have some means of defending themselves. Now again, that some means shouldn't be a super shotgun, rocket launcher, grenade launcher combo. And it is a hard balance to walk for a lot of these games, because the more effective combat is, the more it downplays your other tools. Should I spend 10 minutes hiding, waiting for this enemy to slowly walk by? Or do I just run right in their face with my axe and do a heavy strike into a dodge counter and knock them out? And it's oftentimes where we solve kind of breakdowns in action stealth design. Yes, being sneaky is great. So it's just going behind every enemy, hit the knockout button, and then the entire level is completely clear. And you'll, of course, have people who argue, well, if someone wants to play the game action or someone wants to play it horror, let them. They'll be that person who will go through your game completely, without killing a single enemy. Just you have someone who will try and beat the game with every enemy dead. But we don't want to focus on extreme challenges when it comes to the baseline of your title. If you're telling me your game is supposed to be a scary psychological thriller, and I'm more focused on building up my style meter, something is not working. And oftentimes it's going to lead to issues when it comes to the pacing or structure. That you're spending so much time on the combat or so much time on the stealth that it's getting in the way of the main gameplay loop. And with Silent Hill F, it doesn't exactly have that problem when it comes to stealth. But as we're approaching at this point, maybe we're like 70 to 75% done, it is starting to feel very repetitive in terms of combat. And it's even in situations where I don't want to be fighting. Again, I don't want to be using my limited weapons. But when you lock me in an arena with an enemy and say, kill everything in it, I don't necessarily have a choice in that matter. And you have to be very mindful as to how things are being depicted in your game. To return to Doom again, the whole point of Doom is the power fantasy that the only thing they fear is you. That wouldn't necessarily work if we're making a Resident Evil or a Silent Hill game. It could certainly work in a new Dead Space. But this can lead to games where the execution works, but you failed the assignment. And the Callisto Protocol, I think, is another sound example of this. We played through the entirety of that game on stream, and there were a lot of horror fans who hated that game because it wasn't horror. It was a fairly solid third-person action shooter. But that's not what the developers are advertising. It would be like going to school and turning in your fully completed math homework in your history class. It's correct, but that's not the assignment that you were asked to do or that you wanted to do. And like we've said, when we have situations where the game is not meshing with the marketing or the intent by a developer, it often leads to these games just kind of missing their audience entirely. If the Callisto Protocol was advertised as a new Dead Space or a new third-person action horror or a Doom-like, it would have had a far different appeal and a far different market. Now, of course, that means that anyone who's interested in a survival horror or a horror game probably wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. But it's better for people to go into your game with the knowledge that this is a game that they're expecting to play or that they're expecting to get certain gameplay, rather than buying your game and realizing that the entire marketing for the game was wrong. Because then they're going to really hate you for it. So to wrap things up for our video, horror and combat do work together. But when we talk about horror and combat, a lot of people misconstrue that as combat should be janky and awkward. That it should take 90 minutes where you lift up a lead pipe and then slam it down. And that's not necessarily it as well. Combat should be chaotic, yes, but there's a difference between having very chaotic and over-the-top combat versus it just feels very painful to do. And this again gets at this kind of balance between the two. Because, as I said, a few of you will probably want to type down below, well, combat should be hard to do in a horror game. But there are different points about this. We can talk about having weapon durability, having the enemy being a very high threat. One of the things I did like about Silent Hill F is that the enemies are very erratic in terms of their movement. It's not a case of a lot of other horror games where, oh no, the enemy is slowly coming at me. Let me wait until they're at the exact position every time. Heavy strike, stun, kill. There's a lot more there's a lot more danger to fighting these enemies. And that's what we want to see. But we don't want combat to just feel like I'm just hitting one button for the next 90 minutes or the next 90 fights. And like we said, it's a very hard line to walk. Because you can look at very high action horror games, stuff like Cry of Fear or Condemned, where you're getting into fights a whole lot, and combat is meant to be very fluid, it's meant to be very reactive. But that's compensated by the fact that the enemies are high danger threats. You take a few hits in either one of those games, especially on the higher difficulties, and you're done. Doesn't matter how great you are at shooting or punching, when enemies can take most of your health bar in a single hit. And in these cases, you have combat, but it's still a very risky prospect to do it. For those of you watching, what do you think about combat and horror? And can you think of great examples of games that gave the player the means of fighting back even without having direct combat systems? And other examples of games where the combat felt balanced with trying to scare the player? So with that, have a great Halloween, play more horror games, and we'll see what other spookiness we can get to before the month is over. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you enjoyed the video, do the YouTubing stuff, Be sure to visit our Discord and Patreon, and you're interested in more in my thoughts on design, check out my game design books.